Fred Birnbaum and Brett Farruggia of Idaho Freedom Foundation, who presented a conservative budget for Idaho earlier this week. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
So, Fred, I guess just tell us, what is this budget all about?
Well, again, thanks, Brian, for having us. And I think what this budget is about in a nutshell is returning Idaho to a sustainable path on budgeting. There's an old saying, change before you have to. And I think, unfortunately, at all levels of government, with spending and deficits and debt, often we change after we have to. And Idaho has a balanced budget, and that's a fact. But this year, meaning the current fiscal year 26 and the next fiscal year, as has been widely reported, the state faces a deficit. And so our conservative budget is a way to address a structural deficit, which we believe is now what it is, on an ongoing basis. So in other words, not just do some one-time tweaks, but to change the path of spending so that Idaho is on a sustainable fiscal path.
It's interesting what you said at the beginning about changing before you have to. I remember our lieutenant governor at a Lincoln Day saying that the hard lesson for the legislature is that you have to, you have to make change in the good years, because it's not the bad years that'll kill you, it's the good years, which is interesting considering, I don't think he has necessarily a reputation for cutting spending quite a bit. But that seems to be, people agree on the problem. I was talking to Senator Groh last week, the co-chair of JFAC, and he was saying, yeah, we're going to have to cut. So I guess the question is, what and where can we agree on that we need to cut?
So before I turn it over to Brett, I just want to talk a bit about some assumptions that we think are necessary as you look at this. So, nationally in the country, of course, we all remember COVID, unfortunately. We remember the masks, we remember the vaccines, but we need to also remember the fact that the federal government shotgunned out a ton of money. And Idaho at all levels was the recipient of over $22 billion. And typically at that time, Idaho was appropriating at the state level $9 billion. And the $22 billion included checks to people, money to the state, money to cities. And that money does flow through the economy and into coffers, government coffers through taxes. So what it did is it unleashed a lot of spending. And so when Idaho accepted the ARPA money, the governor did promote a bill that said, hey, this money should be used because we're borrowing for our grandkids for things like deferred maintenance, capital projects. It should not feed ongoing spending. And it ended up feeding ongoing spending. So what we're proposing and what we did is we said, well, let's go back to before COVID, which would be fiscal 20. And let's look at what spending would have grown if it had grown by a limitation of population and inflation. In other words, taking those into account. Where would we be? And then our model, which Brett developed, and he can go into detail, said, okay, if we need to be under 13 billion to essentially grow at that rate, and the agencies have asked for about 14.5 billion, how do we get there? So what our model did was take the agency requests and make cuts and adjustments such that we would get back to the sustainable path that we should have been on if we had just extrapolated the spending from the COVID period, if that makes sense.
Honestly, it boggles my mind that, there are projections of revenue shortfalls and we have to have a balanced budget, and the governor's ordered these 3% cutbacks in, non-education spending. And yet all the agencies came back and asked for above and beyond in their fiscal year 2027 budget. It's like they just assume that the money will just appear somewhere, like we're the federal government, we can just print it. Well,
I'd like to get into the model a bit with Brett, but just to kind of respond to that, I think that is another issue, a parallel issue, and that's the structure of budgeting issue, which is agencies are, and they might disagree with my characterization, but I would say they're budgeting in a silo. So one of the things a governor and or a legislature could do would be to set an overall spending target. And let's just say that it was, I'm just using some round numbers, roughly 14.1 billion in fiscal 26. That's actually very close to what it was. And the governor said, look, we're having a revenue shortfall. We have to come in at 14 this year. That'd be 100 million less. And then the agencies essentially would compete for funds based on how well they executed, their various programs, evaluation of needs. So they would actually be competing so that they stayed under that target. Instead, they view themselves as independent entities, and they're going to ask for what they think they need to do. So then you just gross all that up, and that's why you got what you just mentioned, which is a actual increase in the budget, even though the revenue picture says we're getting less revenue. So there is a mismatch there. And obviously the governor hasn't presented his budget. Just so for your listeners, the agencies submit their requests. They're not done in a vacuum. Obviously they're executive agencies. Not all of them. There's some constitutional officers, but mainly executive agencies. And then the governor reviews those further. And then in January, he'll present another budget. And it could be similar, it could be a lot different. But if it's not a lot different, then we won't cut the budget enough to balance it.
So tell us about this model.
Yeah, so I'd like to get into that a little bit, and I'll show it in a second, but I just wanted to say before, so that paper we presented on at the Capitol Presser, this is basically built directly off some template pages in the LSO's budget book that they released. So the point of making it exactly like you see is that it directly aligns with how the LSO and the legislators will see the budget come January, come the beginning of session. So we thought that was really important that it was built to look exactly like that, so that there was a one-to-one correlation between that and the LSO, so that you could compare them side by side. So I thought that was just important to mention off the bat. So I'm going to bring it up. So here's one of many tabs, but this tab looks most like the one we presented. This is basically an Excel version of that one we presented. So how this works is this page is going to show what you saw handed out at the Capitol, 2026, 2027 agency requests. We have a line for the governors we're waiting on, and then we have ours, which is obviously you see for education, it's lower. So this is the front end. This is how it outputs, but then this is the back end. So this is specifically for all funds. So we have a general funds page and an all funds page. And how this is going to work is we take the budget requests, the DFM budget requests, we run them through not only a manual check that I do, but I also spent a week or two writing a program so that we can put the budget information. It's a big giant packet. It's like 120 or 500 pages if it's the health and welfare budget. You put that in, it's going to pull out your maintenance request, which is basically what it takes to keep the lights on, or what they say it takes to keep the lights on, just flat, no change. We're not going to grow the budget at all outside of their benefits and their CEC. And then so that we pull the maintenance out, we pull their benefits out, we pull their change in CEC is change in employee compensation, we pull that out so that we can actually have variables and mess with those numbers as well. If we want to say 1.5% or 1 or 0.5%, or there's been some controversy over how much healthcare is going to rise. So we have the ability to change those variables, and then we produce our maintenance budget, where you'll see here is the same. We've left it at 1% CEC in our presentation. And then over here is the fun stuff. So over here on these lines, there's many lines. There's stuff to do with Doge. There's over here is enhancements. So we pull all the enhancements out they're asking for as well. You can see the total for the schools. They're asking for $239 million in enhancements. I know it's a negative number there, but the way it adds out is negatives become positive. That's why it's a blue. So that's a growth in the budget of $239 million. But the fun stuff is mostly right here in the middle. These are the adjustments we can make to every agency. And these are specific programs that we wanted to pull out. We pull their wages out, we pull the program costs out, and then these will be subtracted from the budget based on this code over here, which is, you see M would associate with tab M. So that would subtract the 50 million. This is a grant for special education from the federal government. And the concern here, why we just as an example, the reason we pulled this out is because the federal grant will run out. And then, sorry, this is a standalone grant, but there is a federal grant. This one, sorry, incorrect. This one is a federal grant for $80 million for childcare. This is going to run out. And then what they'll do is they'll go to the state and ask for the 80 million in state funds to cover when the federal runs out. So that's why we're concerned about something like that. This is a 50 million grant for special education that we believe there's going to be some pushback on. This is IDLA,
the Digital Learning
Academy, which has many problems associated with it. And then this is what the 3% cut that the governor left out to education, 82 million. This is 3% of their general fund funds, 82 million. We're going to cut to their discretionary spending is what we're asking for. So that's kind of how the back end is built. This is just one example of the education. So we have numerous others. There's Medicaid expansion right there. So that's how we can build it. And I think what's really interesting is throughout, this time and during the session and all that, we can move numbers and stuff around depending on what's going on. And if someone wants to see how the budget would look, if it has this in it or not that, or we change their CEC or their benefits change, it can all be built out with just relatively simple keystrokes and chains of numbers now. So we have a good basis to be able to look at the budget, update the budget, see how different things will play out in the budget. And we've done this for every agency. We have, all their enhancements and line items and other spreadsheets. So there's a lot that can be done to analyze the budget. And as the session goes on, it's very hard to decide or look at a budget like the DOT's budget I always bring up. Well, do they need 6 excavators? I can't tell you, but as we get into the session and as you hear probably testimony from these agencies about what is required, we might have to look at enhancements that they want and maybe change stuff like that. But that's what I think the model is very powerful for, is to be able to go through and change all of that just based on the information we get. And obviously we've produced a budget number 1.9 billion about that we think less reduction that we think is reasonable, just looking at the programs we can see right now.
So just a couple of points I'll add to that, because for some of your listeners, viewers, that sounds like a lot of math, and here's a big Excel model, just kind of getting into the sort of the why and the how. For those of us, so this will be my 12th session, and typically the way the budgeting has worked is that the governor presents this budget he has developed in an 800-page book, and it's a static model, right, Brian? It's a book with pages in it, and as they review agencies and they make decisions on whether an agency,
something like this,
they make decisions on whether an agency should get more or less money. You really don't know what is the final output going to look like. And really, we don't know that almost to the end of the session. So the advantage of having this model, and I'll just give you an example, is you could, after say, a month, and they've reviewed some major agencies and you kind of get an idea of where JFAC is going, you could plug that in and then you make some assumptions, based on the trends of these other agencies, where it will end up. And you could say, well, gee, this looks like an insufficient cut, or this is going to be a cut that'll get us within 100 million. And so that people could make some real-time decisions. LSO, and I probably should say this for the benefit of your audience, it's the Legislative Service Office, and they have a budget division, budget and policy division. They obviously have databases and models, but it's not really accessible and visible to the public that shows the total. And so we can help the public and legislators with sort of a running total. Obviously, you've got every month that passes, you have new revenue data, right? And that can be filtered in here as well. And of course, there's going to be discussions and maybe some decisions at some point during the session on what do we pull from the rainy day funds, if anything. And then if the tax policy is passed on conformity, that'll certainly impact the revenue number. And if if you know where your revenue is going, obviously to have a balanced budget, that sets a cap on the spending. So a lot of stuff here. I think the big difference from what we did in the past is we have a live, real-time, actionable model as opposed to looking at just agency spending and requests discretely.
I think that's fantastic. It gives more tools not only to voters, citizens, people who call their legislators, but the legislators themselves. They're going to be thrown in there into the session, dealing with hundreds of bills, and those obviously on JFAC have even more work. So I hope that'll be helpful and useful to them as they actually, try and find ways to fix this. A couple of questions I had. My biggest one is how much of this can be done in JFAC, but how much is actual policy? Like removing Medicaid expansion, that has to be a bill that goes through the legislature, and that's the big chunk of this, $1.9 billion. But what about the other ones? How much can JFAC do to trim these budgets?
So a lot of it, there's some portions that are policy, but anything that's basically a reduction and not, a total elimination or total ending of a program, you can do in JFAC. So stuff like this $82 million to discretionary spending in the schools. If you say, well, we're going to cut discretionary spending by X number of $1 million, then that's something that JFAC can do. That's not a policy change. It's a budget reduction, especially because schools have $400-ish million in discretionary spending, I believe. So that's money that they can pick and choose what to spend on. So there's not really policy modifications there. And the other thing you can do is these are full removals, right? This is 26.7 for IDLA. Who knows if they would actually, totally get rid of it. We would want them to, but they can also do reductions to these budgets, and those aren't policy changes. So yes, removing the IDLA in its whole out of text would actually be a policy change, right? But you could also severely reduce their budget without having to venture into, is this a policy change? Do we have to go to, has to venture outside of JFAC and things like that? Do you have anything else to add to that?
That's a great question, Brian. So obviously Medicaid expansion, or Medicaid and Medicaid expansion per se, because it's a joint federal state program and it's in code. And once you sort of sign up for it, you'd have to make policy changes to reduce it, because people who are then therefore eligible, you can't say, well, we're only going to give you half the benefit. So that's obviously a big one. But to Brett's point, I think there's two things. Yes, JFAC can reduce budgets without eliminating the agency, but there's actually something that you brought up I think is interesting, which is something JFAC may not have done. I'm sure they've done it, but they don't do it frequently recently, which is they could actually recommend or request of the germane committee, hey, we've looked at this, the agency presented, I don't want to pick on digital learning, but maybe I will. We just think we don't want to fund it, so we're actually requesting a policy bill, and we'll write a trailer bill to zero it out, as opposed to take it from 20-something million down to 5 or something. And so they might say, look, as the budgeting agency, we have to balance the budget, and we're actually requesting these changes. They do have a couple of tools, not more than a couple, but they have a number of tools. They can write intent language, which puts handcuffs, and of course they've done that with the ITD bill as related to the State Street location. Hey, you can't sell this. So they actually have leeway. But one of the things people forget, JFAC sets the pay and benefit for state employees, the change.
Yep.
And that's a big number. I mean, if they said we're giving a 1% versus a 2 versus a 4, and once they make that decision, it's shotgunned in each and every bill. So if you're on the floor and you happen to disagree with we call it the CEC, change in employee compensation, really your only avenue is just to vote down the bill and say, look, I'm voting down everything until you revisit the CEC. That hasn't been done, and I'm not suggesting they do it. But JFAC picks the revenue number. JFAC picks the suggested pay raise. And then, like I said, it goes in all the bills that have people that get pay. And then they also pick the benefits piece. And actually the benefits piece, meaning health care and every other associated benefit, is probably going to cost more. The change in the benefits is going to cost more, at least at this juncture.
Yeah, it will at this juncture.
Far more than the likely pay raise. And just so your audience, so they understand how that works, is that Idaho is largely self-insured with some tweaks. So there's a totality of cost, and you divide the totality of cost by the number of employees, and you get a cost ascribed per employee. And that covers the employee and their dependents, right? So if the total consumption is X hundred million and you have 20-some thousand employees, there's an allocation per employee. And then the decision is how much does the taxpayer or the state pick up and how much does the employee? That whole thing is done in JFAC. So that's a major policy decision. So yes, some of the policy decisions would require germane committees to write bills, but a lot of them could be done within JFAC, certainly. And there's a mixture because, as Brett alluded to, you could reduce an agency substantially without a policy bill, but to probably pull it out of code, you would need one. So that's actually sort of a 1-2 punch, because it works the other way. Remember when they add new programs, JFAC runs a trailer bill to pay for them. And so you would just kind of do the reverse. You would, if you eliminate it, you would run a trailer bill to zero them out.
I did have a couple of questions about some of the specific items,
Sure.
some of the larger cuts that show up, like cutting 34% from the office of the governor. What
Yes.
specifically is that?
So specifically in the office of the governor, a big chunk of that is launch under the Workforce Development Council. I believe it's about 85, 86 million. The other cuts are a combination of some smaller programs, and this was one of the agencies that we decided to scrutinize and cut at a larger degree. You'll see those 89 million cuts to fastest growing agencies on some of our pie charts. That we looked at, you can actually see it here. This is a tab we have in our spreadsheet that we did some numbers with inflation to see how big these grew. And if we go to, where's our office of the governor? Self-governing agencies. Where are we? Governor, but it's that. Yeah, see this one? 150%. That's its growth over inflation. It's like 300% from based on nominal numbers. So we looked at a couple of these agencies and said, we're going to give them bigger cuts. What we're working on now, you see our website has some stuff. We're by the end of this week probably going to have a line item of what's happening in each one of these agencies. It's going to be a page for each agency. So this is partly discretionary on their part, though. We're saying you've grown so fast, we want to cut you, but you can figure out partly what this is going to be. And we'll have suggestions. There's some stuff in there that some agencies, I think Mineral Resources is in there, which is an agency that was set up by executive order. It's not even in statute, yet it's talked about in statute because they have to fund it. So it's very strange. So we have some ideas about what that entire cut will be, but a large portion of it is going to be launch under the Workforce Development Council. So that is sort of office of the governor. The same thing really applies to self-governing agencies. There's a lot of growth in there. And as your viewers may know, there was an amendment that said you can only have 20 agencies. And then they made the office of, self-governing agencies and then put a bunch of agencies under them. So that's what's going on with those sort of bigger line items there in the, self-governing and the offices of the governor. They have a lot of different and numerous sundry agencies under those. So that's what's kind of happening with there. You'll see. I'm looking for other big ones.
Well,
Idaho Public TV was one that jumped out at me, almost 25%.
Yeah, and that's
specifically a dedicated grant that they receive for certain educational. Was
that the Millennium Fund?
It was grant? I believe so. It was some sort of grant of that nature. So a lot of what you see here, though, for Idaho Public Television is their budget from the state. About 2/3, from what I understand, of their money, $8 to $9 million, is all private funded, continuously appropriated donations to a Idaho Public TV, organization, trust, nonprofit type thing. This is only money from the state. So a lot of this supports, right now, once this dedicated grant doesn't support anything to do with the emergency broadcasting or Idaho Public TV or, Capital Television. This was specifically a grant for a program.
It might have been smoking
content.
cessation or
Yeah,
something.
that's what it was.
Yeah.
It was that campaign. So that's a cut, and it looks gigantic, but it's actually their whole budget isn't pictured here, and it's not to critical services. It's specifically for content.
Yeah, you mentioned continuous appropriation, and I guess I'll close by asking about some of the structural changes you're recommending to the budgeting process.
Yeah, so I spoke about that at the end of my speech. It was about the last page, or about last quarter, was talking about the structural process. I think that line items and everything, this is important. We need to pursue this. We have to get these cuts because the budget it's not going to work this year. But in the long term, also looking at the structural problems in the budget and really how it's reduced is where you're going to see sustainable savings. So continuous spending is something that the legislature does, and it's not inherently bad or evil or anything, but the way it's been used since really over these about decade, would you say?
Particularly the last few
years, is they move hundreds and hundreds of millions into continuous appropriations, which they just get. It's every year. It's just appropriated. It's strange to even call it an appropriation because they don't really. There's no bill that says this money goes there. It's just in statute somewhere that says $125 million to the building fund for schools every single year. Just goes in based off they get it from sales tax usually, and it just continues. And it's hard to find in the budget sometimes. Sometimes it's not even in the budget book they produce. It's outside of it. It just doesn't. It exists, but it's not actually totaled up in the budget.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple just to clarify for your viewers. So there's lava hot springs. If you go back to the budget book 6 or 8 years ago, there's actually a section on lava hot springs. When it was made continuous, it actually disappeared from the budget book. So we don't even know what it spends. I mean, you'd have to go to Lava Hot Springs board and get a copy of the budget. So that's a type of continuous appropriation with actually no oversight or visibility. You do have continuous appropriations that are subsets of agencies. So, for example, with schools, some of the money for building maintenance has now been made continuous. So effectively what happens is money can directly come from the sales taxes every year without a bill or legislative oversight. The amount of money they've directed, and it'll just go right to the schools. And the problem with that is if you increase continuous appropriations every year, it makes the growth of spending look smaller, right? Because it's not added to the percentage change. And so you can say, gee, we only grew spending 2%. When it might have been 4 or 5 if you added back the continuous. And then so that's one problem, obviously. The second problem, what you can't see, you can't manage. And so what we've suggested, and I don't want to say that we're the only ones, JFAC actually had a comprehensive presentation at their last meeting on continuous appropriations. And so you can go to their website, you have to do a little digging, and you can see the extent of the continuous appropriations. So they are now going to put it back in the budget book. What isn't clear is this going to be a backwards look, or are we going to see it going forward as a request, or at least as a amount that's projected, like with other budgets? So it's one thing to know what it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago, but what is it going to be a year from now? And that's what we're advocating for, is that they should see that so that when they budget for an agency, they understand the totality of the spending, including the off-budget continuous appropriations.
Yeah, well, I'm optimistic. I don't know if we'll, get 1.9 billion in cuts, but hopefully we'll get in the right direction this year. And I'm glad that people are talking about these things and presenting tools for people to get more involved. This is a huge, it's hard to even conceive of $14 billion, much less $40 trillion at the federal level.
I don't think anyone can see at the federal level what's going on.
Fred Birnbaum, Brett Farruggia, Idaho Freedom Foundation, thank you for your time.
And
thank you.
One thing, stay tuned. We'll provide more information as we get closer to the session so that it'll be a little more granular for your viewers, so that it'll make a little more sense. Right now, we've just shown it at a high level, but we'll provide more information as we go forward.
I'm currently working on collating that sort of. It'll be kind of like a budget book. I mean, it's not going to be 500 pages, but it'll have a page or two on each agency, and there'll be the cuts in our budget, and then other sort of things that we think, hey, we didn't put this in our budget, but if you want to look at cuts, it could be this, that, or that. So I'm working my way through that right now. So next couple days here, you might see it.
Great. I'm looking forward to it, and I'll keep my eye out.
Thank you.